Everything you think you know about the Vikings is probably wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. The hair, the heritage, even the idea of what a Viking actually was, the image that's been built up over centuries through paintings, films, textbooks and television, turns out to be mostly a story we told ourselves. And the reason we know this now is because of something the Vikings themselves could never have imagined. Their bones have started talking. In 2020, scientists completed the largest genetic study of Viking remains ever conducted. They sequenced the DNA of over 400 individuals, men, women, children and babies, pulled from burial sites across Europe and Greenland. And what they found didn't just add a footnote to the history books, it rewrote the opening chapter. So if you grew up picturing a specific type of person when you heard the word Viking, stay with this. Because the real story is far more interesting than the legend. The Viking Age runs roughly from the late 700s to the mid-1000s CE, about 300 years. It begins by most accounts on a June morning in 793, on a small island off the northeast coast of England called Lindisfarne. It's a monastery. Remote, wealthy and completely unprepared. Ships appear on the water. Men come ashore. By the time they leave, the monastery is in ruins, the monks are dead or taken, and the rest of Europe has just received a message it won't forget. For the next 3 centuries, Norse seafarers push outward in every direction. West to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually the coast of North America, roughly 500 years before Columbus, south to France, Spain, and into the Mediterranean, east along the river systems of Russia and into the heart of the Byzantine Empire. They trade in Constantinople, they raid in Ireland, they settle in England and Normandy and Sicily. The reach of these people is by any measure astonishing. But here is where the story gets complicated. When we picture the people doing all of this, we almost always picture the same thing. Tall, fair-skinned, blonde, distinctly Scandinavian, fierce and homogeneous. A single, clearly defined group of people with a shared ethnic identity sailing under a common banner. The DNA says that picture is wrong. Almost entirely. The word Viking itself is the first clue we missed. It comes from the Old Norse word vikingar, and it likely meant something closer to pirate or raider. It was a job, an activity, something you did, not something you were born as. There is no evidence that people in Scandinavia during this period called themselves Vikings. That label, applied broadly to an entire culture and people, largely came later, built up by outsiders, and eventually romanticized into the version we inherited. What the genetic study revealed goes much further than a naming debate. When researchers analysed the DNA of those 442 individuals from burial sites stretching from Greenland to Ukraine, they found that many of the people classified as Vikings, buried with weapons, with longships, with full Viking honours, had no Scandinavian ancestry at all. At a burial site in Orkney, Scotland, 2 male skeletons are found with Viking swords. Classic Viking burials by every archaeological measure, but their DNA is Pictish. They are local Scottish people. Genetically, they have nothing in common with Scandinavia, yet they are buried as Vikings, with Viking goods, in a Viking cemetery. Whatever made them Viking, it wasn't where they came from. This keeps happening across the study. People who by genetics are from southern Europe, from Asia, from the British Isles, all found in Viking contexts, given Viking burials, integrated into Viking society. The conclusion the researchers draw is direct. Viking identity wasn't ethnic, it was cultural, social. It was something you could join. And then there's the matter of what the Scandinavians themselves looked like. The study finds that Viking Age Scandinavians were significantly more likely to carry genes associated with dark hair than people living in Scandinavia today. The modern image of the blonde Viking warrior is, genetically speaking, more myth than reality. Scandinavian populations became lighter over time, partly through the same ongoing exchange of genes that was happening across all of Europe. The blonde Viking is not historically inaccurate in every case, but as a defining feature of the whole group, it doesn't hold up. This is where the genetic picture becomes genuinely surprising. The study finds evidence of gene flow into Scandinavia from southern Europe and Asia that predates the Viking Age entirely. Before the first longship ever raided a monastery, the populations of what we now call Norway, Denmark and Sweden were already being shaped by migration and genetic mixing from far outside their region. There's Asian ancestry in Viking DNA. There's Southern European ancestry in Viking DNA. The Sami people, reindeer herders from the far north with Asiatic roots, who historians had long assumed were isolated from or hostile towards Scandinavians, show up in Viking genetic profiles as well. The populations were mixing, continuously, across what we would now consider enormous distances. This matters because the narrative of the Vikings as a pure, isolated, homogeneous Nordic people, which some groups have historically used to support ideas about racial heritage, is simply not supported by the evidence. The genetics tell a different story. The Vikings were the product of centuries of movement, mixing, and contact across a wide geography. They were, by modern standards, a multi-ethnic society, not by policy or ideology, but because that's how human populations have always actually worked. The study also uncovers something that cuts against another popular image, the idea of Vikings as a tight-knit, uniformly connected culture. Groups within Scandinavia were in fact more isolated from each other than researchers expected. There are clear genetic differences between the populations of what is now Norway, Sweden and Denmark, and the study finds that these groups largely did not mix with each other. They had different genetic profiles, different destinations when they went abroad. Norwegians went west to Ireland, Iceland and Greenland. Danes pushed into England. Swedes moved east toward the Baltic countries and Russia. The Viking world was not a unified movement. It was a collection of distinct regional peoples who happened to share a language, a mythology, and a talent for building exceptional ships. Here is another thing the DNA study quietly confirms. In one boat burial in Estonia, researchers find 4 brothers. They died on the same day. The rest of the men in the boat are genetically similar, likely from the same small town or village in Sweden. A raiding party, assembled from a tight community of people who probably grew up together. This is not the image of anonymous, interchangeable raiders. This is a group of men, some of them siblings, who got on a boat together and did not come home. And whoever buried them, possibly a different raiding group, possibly locals, laid them to rest with enough respect to give them a proper burial. It's a detail that changes how you see the raids, not as organised military campaigns by some great unified Norse nation, but as smaller, intensely local ventures. Young men, often from the same village, following a leader they trusted, taking extraordinary risks for the chance at wealth, land or status they couldn't get at home. Because here's the reality of Viking society that tends to get lost in the drama. Most people were not raiders. The overwhelming majority of people living in Viking Age Scandinavia were farmers. They grew barley, oats and vegetables. They raised cattle, pigs and sheep. They lived in longhouses, a single large building where the family lived at one end and the animals were housed at the other end during winter. Life was structured, unglamorous, and tied to the seasons. The men who went raiding were a minority, often younger sons who had no land to inherit, or men seeking the kind of reputation that could only be built by doing something dangerous. The word of Viking as an activity only applied to those men, and only while they were doing it. When they came home and went back to farming, they stopped being Vikings. Scandinavia did not produce an entire culture of warriors. It produced a culture of farmers and craftsmen and traders who, on occasion, also produced some of the most effective maritime raiders in the history of the world. Those are not the same thing. The raiding is what Europe remembered. But by volume, the more significant activity was trade. Norse merchants established trade networks that connect the far north of Europe to the Byzantine Empire in the east and the Islamic Caliphate further south. Furs, amber and iron from Scandinavia travel thousands of miles and come back as silver, silk and spices. The Varangian trade routes, running south through Russia along the Volga and Dnieper rivers, are among the most ambitious commercial arteries of the medieval world. Vikings reach Constantinople. They serve in the Byzantine Emperor's personal bodyguard, a prestigious unit called the Varangian Guard. Norse mercenaries fight in North Africa. The genetic study supports all of this. The presence of Southern European and Near Eastern DNA in Scandinavian populations isn't just about distant ancestry. It reflects ongoing contact. People moving back and forth, traders bringing wives home from foreign ports, mercenaries settling where they ended their contracts. The movement of genes is evidence of the movement of people, and the movement of people is evidence of trade, contact and exchange on a scale that's easy to underestimate. At the same time, the Norse are also building towns. Dublin in Ireland is founded as a Viking settlement. York in England becomes a major Viking trading hub. Hedeby, in what is now northern Germany, grows into one of the most important ports in northern Europe. These are not temporary camps. They are permanent settlements with craftsmen, merchants, markets, and infrastructure. The people who build them are not just raiders who happen to stay. They are builders, by intention. And in many of these places they integrate. Local people adopt Viking customs. Vikings adopt local ones. The genetic mixing the study finds in Britain, Ireland, and along the Baltic isn't just a side effect of conquest. It's the result of generations of coexistence. The genetic study estimates that the modern UK population carries, on average, up to 6% Viking DNA. For a period that ended roughly 1,000 years ago, that's a significant footprint. And it's not evenly distributed. Communities in northern England, Scotland, and Ireland carry more. People in the far south of England carry less. The distribution of that ancestry maps almost precisely onto where the historical records place Viking settlement and influence. This means that for a meaningful portion of people alive in Britain today, and for many in Scandinavia, Iceland, Greenland, and parts of Russia, the Viking Age isn't just history. It's in the genome, a record written at the molecular level, more durable than any manuscript. But the more striking finding isn't the percentage. It's the nature of what Viking ancestry actually represents. Because if Viking identity was cultural rather than ethnic, if you could become a Viking regardless of where you came from, then Viking DNA isn't a marker of a specific ancestral people. It's a marker of participation in a particular civilization, a particular way of organizing society and moving through the world. The Pictish man buried with a Viking sword in Orkney has Viking DNA in the archaeological sense, even if his blood is entirely local. What the study ultimately reveals is that the boundaries we draw around historical peoples are almost always cleaner on paper than they were in reality. The Viking world was porous. It absorbed people. It was absorbed by them in return. The image of a racially pure, culturally isolated Nordic people sailing out to impose themselves on a passive world is a fantasy, one that says more about the centuries that invented it than about the people it claims to describe. There is a version of history that turns Vikings into a symbol of strength, of ethnic identity, of a particular heritage. That version has been used at various points to argue for racial purity, cultural supremacy, and the idea that some peoples are inherently more capable than others. The DNA doesn't support any of that. What the DNA shows is that the Vikings' actual power came from openness. Their trade networks worked because they were willing to go anywhere and deal with anyone. Their settlements survived because they integrated with local populations rather than remaining permanently separate. The genetic diversity found in Viking Age Scandinavia and in the communities the Vikings built abroad isn't a contamination of some original purity, it's the mechanism by which they actually functioned. The four brothers in the Estonian boat burial are a more honest symbol of the Viking Age than any of the iconic imagery. Four men from the same Swedish village, on a boat with neighbours, who died together far from home. No ideology, no grand narrative about racial destiny. Just people, doing what people do, trying to find something better, taking a risk, and not making it back. And that is, in its own way, a more human story than the myth ever was. The Vikings we thought we knew were a projection. The Vikings the DNA reveals were something more complicated, more diverse, and far more interesting. A civilization built not on blood, but on movement, not on purity, but on contact, not on isolation, but on the willingness to go out into an unknown sea and see what was on the other side. So that's what the DNA actually tells us. The blonde, pure-blooded, ethnically homogeneous Viking warrior was largely a story we inherited and embellished. The reality was a diverse, mobile, culturally absorptive society whose power came from openness as much as from force. Their bones have been in the ground for 1,000 years, and they are still correcting the record. If this kind of history interests you, the kind that pulls apart the comfortable version and shows you something truer underneath, a like helps more people find it. And if you want to see more, subscribe to Human Origins. There's a lot more ground to cover,